this is a policy decision. And of course, what was missing from the president's announcement the other day was what's the strategic outcome? And I know I sound a little bit like a scratch record, but if you don't get the strategic outcome right and clearly defined, then it's hard to come up with good, effective policies which can be implemented.
Welcome to the Focus Podcast. I'm Dr. John Bruni. Today I'm joined once again by retired Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, former Commanding General of the US Army in Europe and one of the most respected voices on transatlantic security. Ben and I recently shared the stage at the Atlantic Charter 2025 and Beyond panel at the Hague Center for Strategic Studies in partnership with the Alphen Group, which was held just ahead of the NATO summit. Today we'll unpack the key takeaways from that summit, discuss Europe's defense dependence on the US, and explore recent military commentary around the vulnerability of the Russian exclave Kaliningrad. Ben, welcome back to the Focus.
John, thank you very much for letting me come back.
Ben, you and I both took part in the Atlantic Charter 2025 and Beyond event at the HCSS on the 23rd of June. What do you think were the most important insights or moments to come out of the panel discussions?
Well, there was a shared anxiety about whether or not the American president, President Trump, would he actually show up? Would he contribute in a meaningful way, or would he blow the whole thing up? Would he try to make it all about himself? Whatever. So I think um, that shared anxiety um, is a terrible thing for our great alliance. That people would worry whether or not the American president would even be there, or would he use it as another chance to kick the Ukrainian president in the ass again, or to do other things. Fortunately, and I think in large part due to the work done by Secretary General Ruda, he did show up. He did contribute. He was in and out of there pretty fast. He even had a pleasant meeting with President Zelensky. And I think that while the obsequiousness of the Secretary General drew a lot of criticism, rightfully so, at least we got out of there without bad things happening and in agreement on the 5%. So stand fast who actually lives up to that, but at least we got through it in a positive way.
Ben, in your view, did this year's NATO summit deliver concrete results, or was it more symbolic, particularly in addressing the pressing strategic realities Europe now faces?
Well, the thing about alliances, John, and in the history of coalitions, they're always hard. I mean, you've got different nations or different groups coming together that have common cause, but that doesn't mean they agree on everything. And that's never been the case with NATO from its very beginning in 1949. You've had the French ejected NATO from France. They left the military infrastructure or the military structure of the alliance. U.S. and Turkey have had difficulties. Turkey and Greece have had difficulties, and these things are part and parcel of any alliance. So the fact that we've grown to 32 nations and that other nations are in a queue that want to still join NATO despite its warts says something about the value of NATO. Uh, what came out of it that was concrete? The number one objective always, always, always is cohesion. That there's no doubt of everybody is committed, even if you've got some outliers like Hungary or Slovakia, for example, or even with the American president. That was important. This 5% commitment, 3.5 for traditional defense investment, 1.5 for infrastructure is significant. Now, the critics will say, yeah, but people are going to abuse the 1.5. Of course they will. We couldn't even get to 2% in some countries, and now all of a sudden Canada agrees to 3.5 of defense. Um, the fact is, he agreed, and now you've got the burden is on the nations to do their part. But it feels to me that the emphasis has shifted more to the importance of readiness. You can't put a sign on your border that says, "Hey, we're 5%, you can't invade us." It's about having real capability. And so I think um, the the statements against Russia were not strong enough, but at least there's still a continued support for Ukraine. This the summits are not destinations; they are waypoints along the life of the alliance.
Ben, you touched on the word readiness and capability. I have to ask you a question, a more technical question with regard to the type of weapons that we in the West are used to using. Readiness doesn't necessarily, come forward in a good manner when we're talking about very complex systems. And it's not just the systems themselves that are complex, but it's the maintenance and logistics behind the systems that drag the chain, if you will. So if you're talking about trying to get a readiness posture up and running for Europe, and we're still dependent on very high tech weapon systems that are very complex to manufacture and maintain, how are we going to get there when we know that there are these hard physical barriers that we've got to get through with regard to defense industry?
Well, of course, what's got to drive modernization and defense industry and the taking advantage of the technologies are the requirements that come from defense plans. And so the alliance took a major step forward back at the Vilnius summit a couple of years ago, where they approved the regional defense plans drawn up by the Supreme Allied Commander, General Cavoli, at the time. So now you've got concrete requirements to be able to do things, and this helps ministries of defense with their modernization efforts, their force structure efforts. So we have to be able to do the following things based on the plan, plus our own uh, domestic requirements for security, et cetera. So that was an important part of this. And of course, everybody is paying close attention to the war, Russia's war against Ukraine, as well as to what China is doing out in the Indo-Pacific region, looking at these capabilities, and we're saying, okay, are we capturing lessons learned? Are we capturing advances and capabilities that we need for ourselves and integrating them? Success is not going to be just mimicking what the Ukrainians are doing or the Russians or the Chinese, but um, how do you take those capabilities and then integrate them into how we plan to fight? I mean, there was people are making fun of it correctly about a U.S. Army video that just came out yesterday, and the Army was so proud that they're doing this demonstration of a drone dropping a grenade, and they kind of asked, "Have you ever seen this before? Like this is really new." And people are like, "Are you kidding?" I mean, Syrians, were doing terrorists were doing that years ago, and obviously Ukrainians they've done more than drop grenades. I mean, they've got flamethrowers and machine guns and all kinds of things hanging off a drone. So that gives you a sense of the long distance we have to go in on the U.S. side of realizing, holy hell, this is going to be different. Now, I sincerely believe that the way you implement change in your military, at least in land forces, is in training and specifically in the big training center. If you want to make change happen in the U.S. Army, you give a capability to the enemy force, the dreaded Op 4 at the National Training Center, or any of the one we have here in Germany, or the one at Fort Polk, Louisiana. These guys cheat like hell. They're the best force in the Army because they train and fight every month against every rotational unit. And so if you want the Blue Four, the rotational units, to come in and get better on something, then they will do everything they can to defeat the Op 4. And that's when people start integrating. How do you stop drones? Because the Op 4 has drones. The Op 4 has incredible jamming capability. The Op 4 has all the systems that the Russians have. The Op 4 has that. So if you want to survive and get better over the 2 week rotation, you have to implement whatever new technology that's out there. So We talk about readiness, we talk about training. That to me is where you can really implement change in your formations.
It's interesting. We're here in Australia. We're currently going through exercise Talisman Sabre, which is, one of the largest military exercises that we have here in Australia, with many countries throughout the Indo-Pacific coming and participating. But of course, war game exercises, they tend to be very scripted. And I don't know whether or not there's that much ability to innovate and integrate real world scenarios where surprises happen.
Yeah.
Can
Mhm.
you just tell our audience, from a military commander's perspective, how scripted are these exercises? And do you really get that sort of real world perspective when you're out in the field just doing training with your allies?
Okay, so this is a really good point, a good question. I'm glad you gave me a chance to address some of this. First of all, of course, there are different types of exercises, and you do certain exercises for different reasons. Um, at the strategic level, you're looking to send messages to your adversaries as well as others in the region that we are committed. We're going to spend a gazillion dollars for this exercise because it's so important. And so this is part of deterrence. And we want to show our adversaries that we can move thousands of troops, hundreds of aircraft, and thousands of vehicles and all the stuff halfway around the world. We can do this, and you need to know that we can do this. So that's part of it. Related to that, of course, on the practical side, is building up muscle memory in your airports and seaports. To unload Abrams tanks, for example, or different types of equipment or helicopters, and then put them into operation. So there's a practical side to that. The working on uncertainty and conditions of uncertainty at the strategic and operational level. So the combatant commander of Indo-Pacific Command, for example, or the commander of Army Pacific, or the various other commanders that might be involved, they get the opportunities to practice those situations typically in a command post exercise, a computer assisted exercise. So simulations where you're dealing with surprise by the enemy. But that's not something that you can do with when you've got real forces, ships at sea and all that. It's a little bit more difficult to orchestrate those kind of things. So if you want the rigor, if the training audience is the admiral or the general and his or her staffs, then you incorporate those. And then, of course, at the tactical level, where you're going against a thinking enemy force, where the battalions and companies or brigade commanders are having to deal with that, you can build that in and do that. So I guess what I'm saying is every exercise doesn't do everything, but the best commanders take advantage of what's being done. I remember one of the best exercises I was ever a part of. I was a captain in the 101st Airborne Division. This was a big division exercise spread all over Tennessee and Kentucky. We had thousands of troops were involved in it. And I realized that my infantry company of 120 Screaming Eagles, we were we were like sandbags as far as the big exercise goes. They were moving us around because they needed to practice air landing and consumption of rations and logistics. So I said, okay, great. Well, I've got a week that we're going to be stuck up here at this other training area, and we're going to do squad level external evaluations. So within the exercise, I was able to construct my own. And I suspect that's what's going on with the Talisman Sabre, that you've got multi-echelon training events happening within the context of a zillion dollar large scale multinational uh, exercise.
You talk about the zillion-dollar multi-level, multi-force exercise, but I mean, I want to dig a little bit into the weeds here because, of course, defense industry officials who manufacture the various weapons that you're training with will have an eye on how their particular products are going, with the idea that the more successful these exercises are, the more, with the various weapon systems, the more likely that the said company will be able to on-sell those weapons to other clients down the chain. How much pressure is there placed by the military in terms of throwing about the weapons in a warlike manner because these things are not cheap. They're hard to replace. You don't want to lose crew under any circumstance. And believe me, I've been in a military exercise where my M113 almost fell into a ravine, but that's another story for another time. But again, it's like going on exercise. Our audience needs to understand is a very dangerous thing under even benign circumstances. But when you're trying to fight a warlike situation, you've got a number of different pressures. You've got the pressures of actually doing a good job as a military commander, but you've also got the pressures that defense industry officials will be putting to make sure that the weapon that they're handing over for the exercise isn't is being acquitted well, shall we say? Um, is that a problem? Do you think?
By the way, I rolled my 113 when I was a lieutenant at Home Pals, a night,
Crap.
a
Yeah.
night movement, typical German foggy night, and we ran off the road. And fortunately, nobody got hurt. And the damage was pretty minor because the mud was so
Yeah.
soft on both sides of this road. So I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yep.
Um, Look, when we're talking about exercises, there's no exercise worth any soldier or sailor or airman getting killed as well. That's just part of the exercise. That's unacceptable. And all of us go to great lengths to do the best possible, rigorous, realistic training exercise, live fire, night operations, all of that, but it's not worth somebody getting killed. So you do things, you do a risk assessment so that soldiers are confident in each other, they're confident in their weapons, and they know how to do this because there will come a time, perhaps, when they have to do this for real, not in a controlled exercise environment, but they still need to be able to execute it. So the height in the Army of training, your goal is to be able to conduct a night live fire exercise in a realistic scenario. Um, when you're talking about large, expensive um, pieces of technology, of course you want it to succeed, but that's not your job to make the equipment succeed. Your job is to get your unit up to a level of readiness. When I was the commander of U.S. Army Europe, I got a call from the U.S. ambassador in Poland. He's an excellent, superb professional diplomat, Steve Mull. And he contacted me. He said, "Ben, look, the Poles are on the verge of buying Patriot. What is there something we can do to help get them over the line?" And of course, it is the job of every ambassador to advocate for American industry, American values, all of that. That would include, of course, Patriot. And I said, "Well, Ambassador, I can't. I'm the commander of U.S. Army Europe. I can't get out there and endorse things. But I tell you what, we can do. We can do a readiness test with our one of our Patriot batteries that are headquartered in Baumholder. This would be exactly in line with what I'm doing with other people. Have them conduct a no-notice convoy all the way to somewhere in Poland, and they could set up and do an exercise there. And then you can invite." Everybody in MOD. He said, "Are you serious?" I said, "Yeah, this will be a great test for a young air defense captain to drive his or her battery all the way from Germany. And it'll be a good planning drill for my staff also to get the permissions." And so we did. And we had like in 3 days, this battery of Patriot rolled out and convoyed all the way to somewhere outside of Warsaw without incident. I think one of the trucks had a maintenance problem, but other than that, no incident. And they got there and set up. And I mean, the people, Polish government were in tears, like, "Oh my God, look at this! Americans are here to help." Um, that was an exercise that had a strategic effect, and of course, I had confidence that our systems will work. On the other hand, we did a Patriot live fire exercise. Crete is the place where you do a lot of the air defense live fire because you can block a large portion of the Mediterranean for a period of time. You can launch missiles out there and so on. And I always wanted to do it a realistic where they were under attack from drones and stuff like that. That was in the too hard to do box. The host nation, Greece, wasn't able or willing to make the necessary changes. So we did a live fire that my old colonel used to call the Arnold Palmer golf putt. Everybody's super quiet, perfect conditions to allow him to putt. So we ended up doing that. So it was more of a technical exercise to confirm that the launchers all work. Um, a significant percentage of the interceptors that we launched failed to function. The launcher itself worked, but the interceptors, the bullet, failed. Um, and of course, I was like, how the F did this happen? Well, sir, we always use the oldest ones, which makes sense. Of course, you use the oldest ammunition. But I said, we just told the Russians that most of our interceptors don't work. Now, this was about 10 years ago. We're in a much, all of the interceptors have been fired over Ukraine by now. So it's newer interceptors. But that really, that told me that damaged my confidence in what we had. And it also told me we've got to do a better job on technical inspection that, just because it's sitting in the depot for a period of time, you have to assume it's still going to work. I
Yeah.
mean, these are not rifle bullets. You rifle rounds,
Mhm.
these are the multi-million dollar interceptors.
Yeah. They're not North Korean shells either. Oh, speaking
No,
of which, North Korean shells. I know we discussed this once before, but a lot's been made recently on some of the various media outlets that North Korea is now going to redouble its efforts in terms of supplying shells to the Russians, which will allow the Russians to increase their firing rates into Ukraine. I mean, it's terrible that this has happened. But how effective are these shells? I remember speaking to Frank Ledwidge, maybe about a year or so back, and we were having a little bit of a laugh with regard to the reliability of North Korean munitions. And I think that Frank may have mentioned that perhaps as much of as two-thirds of the ammunition would not work to specification, which would put the Russians on a bit of a back foot. But they've got enough stuff to keep themselves going. What are your thoughts on the North Korean situation?
I think it's much better for the North Koreans and Russians now than it was a year ago. Because I saw that
Really?
too. The ammunition, there was all kinds of malfunctions, and I think they have fixed or improved whatever they're doing. I spoke about 2 weeks ago with a dear old Ukrainian friend of mine. He's a senior officer who I get to meet with a couple of times a year. And he said, like 40% of the ammunition that Russia uses is North Korean ammunition. I mean, this is
Oh,
huge. It's
yeah.
significant. And um, I think that and I asked him, I said, well, are there no ways to interdict the shipment that, it comes from by rail from North Korea through Russia all the way across? And they did attack the big, it has to go through some big rail tunnel, but enough explosives to drop a tunnel like that, it's not something that a group of special operators can infiltrate.
Mm.
And so the Ukrainians obviously are studying the problem, trying to find ways to interdict that. But for now, it's a huge amount of ammunition that comes in, and enough of that certainly seems to be functioning well enough to cause a lot of casualties. I think General Budanov recently also commented on this, the effectiveness of the North Korean ammunition that's being used against Ukraine. Um, Now, these are not Christmas gifts from the North Koreans. The Russians are paying for this. And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
this is another reason why it's important that we stop Russia's ability to export oil to India and China, going out through
Mm.
the Black Sea and the Baltic Sea in these Shadow Fleet vessels. If you could stop that, then Russia would be much less capable of buying or paying North Korea for what it receives. And likewise, um, giving Ukraine the ability to strike deeper inside of Russia with long-range precision weapons to hit these where the ammunition is being delivered, or also the factories that produce these drones that we saw a video of that just the other day. um, these are the kind of things, this is how you counter what North Korea is doing.
I heard something on YouTube the other day with regard to the whole Shadow Fleet issue. And, it's going to be It'll be interesting to see whether or not anything comes of it, but someone did make mention that perhaps if you were to go after the Shadow Fleet, that brings back the whole notion of privateering on the high seas, and you're going to break down the free flow of commerce on the oceans. Do you think that that's a risk? Do you think that if the Americans and the West generally were to start targeting the Shadow Fleet, that the Russians would make a claim that the West is engaged in piracy? And what would then stop from there? I mean, would such an action set a precedent where other countries would also go after elements of another country's trade
Yeah.
in the course of commerce?
Yeah, so when you and I were together at The Hague back in June, I spoke to a Dutch friend about this very topic. I said, why can't we, get out there and start disrupting? He said, well, here in the Netherlands, they see themselves as a standard bearer for international law. And that was the first thing he talked about. You can't just go out there and start grabbing ships.
Yeah.
So, okay, I'll accept that. But I think there's a bunch of other things that can be done. First of all, a major portion of the so-called Shadow Fleet vessels are owned by Greeks. So EU country, NATO country, what pressure is being put on Greece to stop that? That's number one. Number two, Germany and a couple of other countries recently announced that they are going to begin stopping vessels and checking for insurance. Are these vessels properly insured? Number three, there are laws that enable nations to protect their waters from potential environmental disaster. The commissioner for sanctions of the EU, Mr. O'Sullivan, he describes all these vessels as, quote, end of life vessels.
Mm.
So you can get a sense of the seaworthiness of these things, because what they do when they leave the Baltic Sea or the Black Sea, they then join up with a more seaworthy tanker and transload the oil into these vessels, which then go on to their customer in India or China or wherever. So I think there are several different means to disrupting uh, by using legal authorities, insurance, safety, environmental, um, and you don't have to stop them all, but you got to make it where people stop. It becomes disruptive, and Russia's not able to do it as often. I'm not talking about sinking them, although that would suit me fine. It's interesting that the Russians don't claim these things, but when Estonia went out to stop one a few weeks ago, Russian Air Force immediately sent an aircraft, violated Estonian airspace, and prevented the Estonians from boarding that ship, even though it was not a Russian vessel. So that tells you what they're willing to do already.
Well, I mean, I would say that stronger measures should be made in order to prevent the Shadow Fleet from helping the Russian war effort. However, you've you've got a problem because that fleet is servicing the oil requirements of China and India. Probably it's not such a big deal about China because they're kind of now being painted as a belligerent, an enemy of sorts. I don't know what they are, but anyway, they're painted as the bad guy in one corner, even though we're still trading with them and making money hand over fist. But then there's the Indian issue. Now, the Indians, of course, are technically our friends. And I don't think if they're profiting from having this shadowy relationship with the Russians, that if all of a sudden that cheap oil weren't to just turn up and turn on the lights at night in most Indian cities, that could be a problem for the West, wouldn't it?
Yeah, of course it would. And that's why, these policies we're talking about need to be part of a larger strategy that involves, working with India and China and finding ways either through pressure or coercion or incentives to say, hey, come on, we can make up your oil. We've got three Arab countries over here ready to make up the difference. If you're willing to stop paying or funding Russia's war effort. But that would
Yeah.
require the American president and others to think strategically and more broadly and to identify Russia as the bad guy and help get the alliance and coalition of nations to do more than just donate ammunition to Ukraine, but to also use all of the economic tools that we have. There's a very simplistic thing that we teach in the Army's Staff College and War College that I think most Australian officers would be familiar with. It's this DIME construct, DIME. These are you think about the four main pillars of power or categories of power that a nation or coalition has: diplomacy, information, military, and economy. So any strategy, in addition to the other familiar construct of ends, ways, and means, your strategy has to address the diplomatic efforts, the information efforts, the military efforts, and the economic efforts. Now that's, I mean, this is like, infantry lieutenant level sophistication, but it actually is a good reminder that a strategy that does not have an economic dimension to it, that doesn't look at not only your own defense industry base and your need for resources, but also cutting off the enemies, it's a strategy that's going to fail.
Mm.
Um, so I think that there would be ways to do this, and some of them will be painful, but that's why identifying the strategic outcome is the most important aspect of all of this. And the Biden administration failed to do it. The Trump administration is not doing it. What is it we're trying to achieve with regards to Ukraine and Russia?
Yeah, indeed, indeed. Okay, let's talk about Europe's defense industrial base. Ben, are we at a point where Europe is too reliant on American-made weapon systems, and is that now a strategic liability for the continent?
I think the answer is somewhere in between all that. Of course, as an American, I'd love to see America's economy benefit from customers buying the best possible aircraft and weapons and vehicles, et cetera. Um, but at the same time, I can see living here in Frankfurt that different parliaments and the Bundestag and other defense leaders are uneasy that somehow under the Trump administration, they could that the administration could manipulate what European partners and our allies and customers thought they were getting. I mean, I was drilled by three Danish members of parliament one time, the same week that Vice President Vance was on his little tour of Greenland. The Danes were not very amused by that, and and these members of the parliament were drilling me about, can we really trust F-35? I mean, that the U.S. And so it has an impact on how Europeans perceive the United States as a reliable vendor, if you will, and partner across industry. Um, Understandably, European countries want to have their own capabilities, and each nation wants to protect the industry in its country because of the jobs, the economic benefits. Um, so you see different efforts at joint ventures that have some success, like Airbus, but some things don't. The Future Combat Air System is got a lot of problems. Trying to find a tank that everybody likes, is this is going to be a challenge. Um, at the
Yeah.
end of the day, at the end of the day, I think you're going to see more American companies looking to do joint ventures inside Europe in order to remain attractive to Europeans.
Mm.
Um, but there's no doubt that European countries have got to get serious about their own defense. And that means producing ammunition, producing the capabilities that they need, and producing stuff that is interoperable with each other.
Well, I suppose I could, play devil's advocate here and say, for many years during the high point of the Cold War, there were plans in Europe to make European products interoperable with American products. So there's a long history of trying to tie the continent to the United States so all armed forces could work in unison, which I think is a great idea. However, the idea of strategic autonomy, which is now starting to gain traction, especially in France and other parts of Europe, I mean, is this a practical goal, or do you think it's still mostly aspirational in your view? Yes, we can get them to make more ammunition, maybe more drones, but really, there is that nagging thing about, as you just rightly pointed out, the question about American reliability. And again, will America be happy to part with its IP to its European partners in a sort of joint effort to create a transatlantic weapon supplying system? Or will even the Americans pull back from that because they think, well, that's our IP. Why are we handing it over to the Europeans? There are these other issues at stake as well, right?
Yeah, no company is going to cut its own throat. Their shareholders, certainly in boards, won't allow that.
For
The
sure.
government and the government sometimes is tougher than are the companies on sharing certain things and capabilities for various reasons, most of them good reasons. Um, I think that I don't have a simple answer for this. At the end of the day, strategic autonomy, for what? I mean, what is Europe safer if it's autonomous from the United States? I don't think so. But I would also say that the United States is not safer by going America first, America alone, and turning our back on Europe or other allies, or treating them in such a way that they lose they are looking for alternatives, that they're looking for autonomy because they don't trust us. We're the approach of the administration, we're just screwing ourselves for years to come um, by I mean the access that we have ports, airfields and seaports and access and intelligence relationships in UK, Spain, Italy, Greece, Turkey, Germany, Poland, all over Europe. I mean bases. And that allows us not only to defend our interests in Europe, but of course in the Middle East and in Africa, to be able to project power and influence. And if we don't have a diplomatic approach or international strategic approach to how we interact with our allies, at some point the Germans or the French or the Italians are going to say, "Hey, you can't land here anymore," or "We don't trust you because you have all your top leaders are on some signal chat group sharing classified information. We don't trust you."
Yep.
So we're
Yep.
we're screwing ourselves in this regard. So hopefully, at some point, this administration will wise up and will get more mature leadership. By the way, it's never been harmony at all levels at all times. I mean, even during World War II, between the Allies, particularly the United States and Great Britain, enormous fights because you had different views of the war. Was it to save the empire, or was it to destroy, fascism? And so titanic battles about when and where the next invasion should be, and you're familiar with all that.
Yep.
Um, so we're always going to have friction with our closest allies. That's not unnatural. But I think the way the administration is approaching, you know, kicking the Canadians in the ass, what a foot shot that is. I mean, my goodness. So I hope that we can save ourselves.
Well, speaking of said administration, recently Donald Trump warned that he would impose sanctions on Russia within 50 days if Moscow fails to de-escalate in Ukraine. Given your experience, Ben, in deterrence and transatlantic security, how credible do you believe this threat is from the Russian perspective, and does it hold real strategic weight in deterring future Russian aggression?
Yeah, I hated this. That I sat there watching with the president and Secretary General were next to him, and this had been billed as some huge, big announcement. And at the end of the day, what I heard and what Putin heard was, "Hey, man, you got 7 weeks to do whatever the hell you want." And the Russians have
Right.
responded almost every night with hundreds of drones. So they're telling the world how little respect they have for the Trump administration, how little respect they have for all the rest of us, for Europe, and that they have zero interest in actually negotiating an end to this conflict. Zero, because they are pretty certain that the United States is not really going to follow through on this. And why would the president say, "You got 50 days, 7 weeks"? Why not now? I mean, he's been
Nope.
warning them for months. and they see that he never follows through. And so I think they feel pretty confident he will stop short again, or he'll look for an excuse, or they'll do something at the last minute so he doesn't have to do this. Um, and then the third part of this, which for me was um, less than satisfying, was uh, Patriot. Okay, Patriot is best in class for what it was designed to do. It will do zero against hundreds of drones or glide bombs that are slamming into Ukrainian towns and cities every night.
Yeah.
So while it'll be good to have more capability to knock down Russian bombers and ballistic missiles, it's not going to help with what's causing the most damage. And it's going to take some time. Now, I know people are working very hard right now to do this exchange to get systems to Germany so that Germany can give theirs up to Ukraine. And I think the Germans are moving out on this, but this is not this is not like pallets of artillery ammunition we're talking about. These are complex systems. And I'm anxious to see how many interceptors, the actual munition come along with these launchers. And do you have the radar and all the other stuff? It's not just a launcher. So I was underwhelmed. I would much rather have heard the president say, "That's it. You guys have had 6 months. They're your best chance. You've turned it down. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to give Ukraine everything that they need, us and our European allies. It's going to be a good business deal for the United States, and we're going to put sanctions on you and everybody that buys your nasty oil. Big time sanctions." And that's what we're going to do until you realize that we're serious about Ukraine not only surviving, but winning this war, and you, Russia, living inside your own borders like everybody else does. That would have been, I'd have been popping champagne corks, but instead, I think the only champagne being popped was in the Kremlin.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. You're listening to the Focus Podcast. I am Dr. John Bruni speaking with Lieutenant General Ben Hodges. If you're enjoying this conversation, don't forget to subscribe to the show, leave us a rating, and share this episode with friends and colleagues who follow international security affairs. Now back to the conversation. Well, speaking of Trump and speaking about weapons, let's talk about the Trump team, which has now floated a plan to sell $10 billion in US weapons to European allies, who would in turn transfer their older stock to Ukraine. I mean, on the surface, it seems like a clever workaround, but in strategic terms, is this an effective model for sustaining Ukrainian defenses, or is it a sign of Washington retreating from direct leadership?
This is a policy decision. And of course, what was missing from the president's announcement the other day was what's the strategic outcome? And I know I sound a little bit like a scratched record, but if you don't get the strategic outcome right and clearly defined, then it's hard to come up with good, effective policies which can be implemented. And so, a scheme that's not fair. An arrangement where we're going to sell stuff to Europeans so that they can give theirs to the Ukrainians. Um, it's not illegal, but that's a policy decision that's not connected to an end state. And so um, now I'm going to be a bit critical here. I'm for anything that gives Ukraine more capability. So I'm not against the fact that they're going to get Patriot, for example. But that's not a strategy. Just like giving Javelin to the Ukrainians back in the first Trump administration, that was not a strategy. That was a policy decision. That's not a strategy. What is it that we're trying to achieve? This is how we end up doing exactly what President Trump said he didn't want to do, is that you're involved with a never-ending conflict because there's no end to it that's identified. Stopping the killing is not an end state. A negotiation, that's not an end state. These are the things this is what's missing in my view.
Okay, Ben, let's turn to US General Chris Donohue's recent comments on Kaliningrad. From your military perspective, how strategically vulnerable is this Russian exclave, especially in a NATO-Russia confrontation?
Yeah, I love that CD, General Donahue, said what he said last week at the Land Euro Symposium in Wiesbaden. Um, the uh, the Russians need to know that we are prepared to do things like destroy Kaliningrad. That this is part of deterrence. Same reason we would have ships sailing through the Straits of Taiwan or all the other stuff we do. This is about deterrence. And the Russians know that Kaliningrad is vulnerable because of where it sits. It's surrounded by Lithuania and Poland on both sides, as well as the Baltic Sea, which is dominated by NATO countries. So it is very vulnerable, and I think that um, they should be made to feel that it is vulnerable. Now, um, of course, this is part of a larger effort that General Donahue also described, the Eastern Baltic Defense Line, which is a not a line per se like the Maginot Line, but a defensive effort that runs from Finland all the way down to Poland and down in towards the Black Sea and our other allies that provides a cohesive way to deter Russia from attacking NATO's eastern flank. So um, Russians, as they're contemplating what they would do if they decide to actually attack a NATO country, and I think Latvia is probably the most likely place where they would do this, at some point, they need to know that they would lose Kaliningrad immediately through land forces, as well as strikes that would take out all of their anti-access capabilities, long-range weapons, radar, you name it, all gone in like first hours.
Ben, one of the things that I observed both in Warsaw last year, but also in The Hague this year, is that there is a lack of unity, not among the NATO states as much, but within the political and policy sectors. So you will have uniformed and non-uniformed people working in defense who think a certain way and who know what needs to be done to get a better outcome. Then you have the politicians who sit on top of that. And of course, they're not necessarily wedded to what the policymakers are advising them to do because their remit is so much wider. They have to think about their nation as a whole, not just the military. So of course, they think about hospitals and schools and social welfare and all these other things, which sort of get in the way of them being able to harmonize with people at the military policy level. What do you think? This is a final question. What do you think would it take for a harmonization between the political elite on the one side and the military policymakers on the other? Can there be a unification of purpose?
Yes, absolutely. And it starts with the civilian leadership at the top, laying out to the population, talking to us as if we are adults, and saying, hey, look, these are our interests. This is what's at stake. This is what we're going to have to do. Um, in December 1941, the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor and brought America into the war. Prior to that, no Americans wanted to get involved in a land war in Europe. Most Americans in the 1930s were second and third generation European immigrants anyway. They said that's why we left. We don't want to get back over there. And so Great Britain was all alone on the continent of Europe by middle of 1941 with the Nazi Germany in control of the continent, except for Great Britain. Um, and so Churchill comes across to DC and they have what's called the Arcadia Conference in January 1942. And these two old guys agree that Germany had to be defeated first so that you could have all the resources of the empire available to help then defeat the Empire of Japan. And so the strategic priority of Germany first was agreed. And then you've got Roosevelt and Churchill. And remember, in 1940, 41, the US Army was number 17 in the world, right behind Bulgaria. So we were totally unprepared. And most of our fleet was underwater and still on fire. And so at a time when there was no reason for optimism, these two guys had the strategic foresight and courage to say, we have to defeat Germany first. And then 1 year later at the Casablanca conference in January 1943, still a time when there was not much reason for optimism, they they agreed on a strategic end state of unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany and the Empire of Japan. Now, think about that. We had no reason to be optimistic. We were still trying to get our act together, and they were already deciding on the strategic outcome. And by the end of the war, 3.5 years after Churchill and Roosevelt met, we had 12 million women and men in uniform, thousands of Navy ships, hundreds of carrier. I mean, on and on and on. And it was Roosevelt being able to explain to the American people, before there was internet, by the way, that
No TikTok.
this is what's at stake. This is what we're going to do. And Ford Motor Company, nobody's going to be buying cars for the next couple of years. So you're going to make Army trucks. And Westinghouse, nobody's going to be buying a refrigerator for a while. So you're going to make machine guns, and on and on. And he got the Congress to change the laws as necessary to do this. So that's a long answer to a very good question. Yes, of course, it's possible to align these things, but it starts at the top, where the civilian leadership in democratic countries, the civilian leadership has to have the courage to identify the interests, the threats, and then to communicate that to us, talk to us like we're adults. And most people, if they feel like they're getting straight information, will accept it.
Yep. Ben, thank you for joining us again and for sharing your insights on the focus.
John, thank you again for the privilege.
As Europe and the US navigate increasingly volatile security environments, voices like Ben's help bring clarity and urgency to the conversation. It will be interesting to be a fly on the wall in the halls of power among the NATO nations. Will Europe be able to find autonomy under the American umbrella, or is the fact that European NATO is doomed by being outsized and outclassed by its biggest member, the United States? Thank you for joining me, John Bruni, for today's episode with Ben Hodges. Check out the links in our show notes to learn more about Ben and connect with him on social media. Now on to questions for the audience. Should Europe invest more in its own defense industry, even if it means less reliance on superior US weapon systems? Do you think Kaliningrad represents a strategic vulnerability for Russia, or is NATO overestimating its importance? What was your biggest takeaway from this year's NATO summit? Do you believe the alliance is adapting fast enough to today's security challenges? Let us know in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's a free way to support us. You can also subscribe to the podcast on the Ozcast Network, iTunes, and Spotify, where we'd appreciate your 5-star reviews. Do you have comments or questions about the podcast? Post them in the comments section on YouTube, and I'll do my best to respond to as many as I can. My thanks as ever to the producer of The Focus, Neil Smart. Please stay connected with us on social media. Follow me on X at BruniDoctor and follow The Focus on X at TheFocus_Sage. And don't forget Blue Sky on thefocuspod.adl.bsky.social. From Adelaide, South Australia, you've been listening to The Focus.